You are standing in a forest that no longer exists. The trees are massive, taller than anything you have seen. The air is thick and wet, filled with the calls of birds you have never heard. Birds that have no fear of you because nothing here has ever needed to fear anything like you. And then you hear it. A sound like thunder, slow, rhythmic, getting closer. It steps out from between the ferns and it is enormous, 3.5 meters tall, over 200 kilograms. It has no wings, no talons, no venom. It does not know what you are. It looks down at you with its small round eyes, and it does not move. This is the moa, the great bird of Aotearoa, and it has never in its entire evolutionary history seen a human being. That moment of stillness between you and the moa is one of the most important moments in the natural history of this island, because within less than a century of that first meeting, the moa was gone. Every single species, all 9 of them, wiped from existence on an island where they had thrived for millions of years. And the question that haunts every archaeologist, every ecologist, every person who has ever stood at the edge of a forest and tried to imagine what was lost is this. How did a small group of human arrivals with no firearms, no machinery, no industry end the moa in under 100 years?
The answer is more complicated than blame, and more revealing than you might expect. Your tupuna, your ancestors, arrived in Aotearoa sometime around 1280 to 1300 CE. Scholars like Atholl and Richard Walter have spent decades refining this date, working from the evidence buried in middens and charcoal and the carbon signature of Moor bones. The settlement window is tight. The archaeological record is clear. The first Polynesian voyagers to reach these islands found a land of staggering abundance, but they also found a land that had no experience of human beings. This is the concept ecologists call ecological naivety. The birds, the seals, the fish of Aotearoa had evolved for millions of years in the absence of large mammalian predators. There were no rats here, no stoats, no cats, no dogs before the Polynesian Kiori and Kuri arrived in the Waka. The Moor had no learned fear of bipedal hunters, because no bipedal hunters had ever walked these shores. So when your ancestors stepped onto the beach and the Moor looked at them and did not run, it was not stupidity. It was simply a creature operating exactly as evolution had designed it to. And that made it extraordinarily vulnerable.
The archaeologist Richard Walter, working with sites like Wairau Bar in the South Island, has documented the scale of the initial moa hunt in extraordinary detail. Wairau Bar, dated to the very earliest period of Maori settlement, contains the remains of thousands of moa bones, enormous quantities. The waste is striking. Researchers found evidence of selective butchering, where hunters took only the most energy-rich parts and left the rest. Eggs were collected, not just adults, but juveniles too. This was not sustainable harvesting. This was what ecologists call a megafaunal blitzkrieg. Mental, right? And here is where you have to set aside the instinct to judge and instead try to understand. Your tupuna were not reckless. They were not careless of the land, but they were making decisions inside a context you have to reconstruct carefully. They had just completed one of the most extraordinary ocean crossings in human history, sailing thousands of kilometres across open Pacific waters to find a new home. They arrived in a land that was rich beyond anything in the Polynesian world they had left behind. The moa was not just food, it was a resource of almost incomprehensible scale. 200 kilograms of protein, standing still, looking at you. The ecological concept that matters here is the Allee Effect, named for the American ecologist Walter Clyde Allee. When a species drops below a certain population threshold, it cannot recover, even if hunting stops entirely. The individuals become too scattered to find mates, the breeding pairs produce fewer offspring, the genetic pool narrows, and the slide toward extinction becomes self-reinforcing. By the time your ancestors might have noticed the moa becoming scarcer, the biological tipping point had already passed. There is also the matter of fire. The early Maori settlement period is associated with significant burning of forest in both the North and South Islands. The palynologist McGlone and his colleagues have documented massive pollen shifts in the sediment record corresponding exactly to the period of human arrival. Ancient podocarp forests that had stood for millennia were transformed into scrubland and tussock within a few generations. The moa's habitat collapsed along with its population. Hunting pressure and habitat loss worked together, accelerating what hunting alone might have achieved over centuries. Now, imagine being inside that process, not watching it from the outside. Your iwi, your tribal group, is establishing a new home on a new island. There is no map that tells you the moa is running out. There is no written record of the population 2 generations before you. You are living in a world of immediate abundance, making decisions about the season, the hunt, the harvest that feeds your children this winter. The moa in the next valley does not know you are coming, and you do not know because you cannot know that across the island the same scene is unfolding hundreds of times simultaneously.
Yeah, nah. This was not a failure of wisdom. The ecologist Jared Diamond called this the Blitzkrieg Hypothesis. Not a conspiracy, but the predictable outcome of naive prey meeting a sophisticated hunter for the very first time, across a landscape where neither party had any context for what was happening. By approximately 1400 CE, perhaps just 4 or 5 generations after the first arrivals, the moa was functionally extinct. Not one breeding population remained viable. The Haast's eagle, the largest eagle in the world, which had evolved entirely around hunting moa, vanished with them. A cascade of extinctions followed. Adzebills, giant geese, giant swans, pelicans, a wren, a crow. More than a dozen species of bird that had flourished in Aotearoa for millions of years were gone within 2 centuries of human arrival. Atholl Anderson, in his landmark work Prodigious Birds, argues that the oral traditions of early Maori retain traces of the moa and references to great birds and in the knowledge of places where they were hunted. The word moa itself is thought to derive from a Polynesian root word carried across the Pacific in the memory of a people who may once have known similar large flightless birds on other islands along the voyaging route. But by the time the first Europeans arrived in the 18th century, the moa was so thoroughly gone that there was debate for a generation about whether it had ever truly existed at all, until Richard Owen named it from a single femur bone in 1839. That femur changed everything because it forced the question, where had they all gone? Today, that question has been answered with high precision. Ancient DNA studies led by researchers including Michael Bunce and Alan Cooper, working from moa bones preserved in cave deposits and midden sites, have traced the population collapse with extraordinary accuracy. 9 species of moa, all extinct, all within the human settlement window. There's no volcanic event, no climate shift, no disease that explains the timing. Only one thing changed in Aotearoa around 1280 CE. People arrived. And this is the part where the story turns. Because the very Māori people whose ancestors drove the moa to extinction are also the people who developed, over the subsequent centuries, one of the most sophisticated systems of ecological guardianship in the Pacific world. Rāhui. That is the word, Rāhui. It means a temporary prohibition, a sacred restriction placed on an area of land or water to allow it to recover. When a fishing ground was depleted, a tohunga, a specialist in sacred knowledge, could declare Rāhui over it, forbidding anyone from taking resources until the balance was restored. The penalty for breaking a Rāhui was not just social shame, it was tapu violation. It touched the deepest spiritual laws of the Māori world. This system did not exist in the first century of settlement. It couldn't have. It had to be learned. And the Moa and its terrible disappearance may have been part of what taught it. The Māori ecological framework that emerged over the 5 centuries between the extinction of the Moa and the arrival of European ships is documented by scholars like Anne Salmond, whose work on the deep relationship between Māori people and the natural world has transformed how historians and ecologists understand Indigenous environmental knowledge. The concept of Kaitiakitanga, guardianship of the natural world, is not a romantic idea imposed from outside. It is a framework that emerged from a real history of loss and adaptation, shaped by people who lived close enough to the land to see what happened when the balance broke. The moa cannot be brought back. 9 species. Gone. The Haast's eagle that hunted them? Gone. A world that took millions of years to evolve ended in the span of a single lifetime, repeated across generations too short to see the whole picture. But the lesson that the Moa's extinction planted in the culture that followed it is one of the most remarkable transformations in the environmental history of the Pacific.
Your tupuna hunted the moa to extinction, and then, in the long silence that followed, they built something in its place. A way of being in relationship with the land that said clearly and without apology that the world does not belong to the people who arrive in it, that abundance is a gift under obligation, that when something goes quiet in the forest, you have a responsibility to ask why. Kia ora. You stood in that forest at the beginning of the story, and the moa looked at you and did not run. Now stand in that same forest again. Feel the stillness. Hear how many voices are missing. That silence is the lesson your tupuna left behind, and whether you carry it forward is a question only the living can answer.